It began with a toast. Candles flickered, crystal goblets clinked, and the scent of roasted venison and saffron drifted through the hall. But by dawn, the heir to Florence was dead. Murdered, they whispered, not by sword or rebellion, but by the food on his plate. This wasn't just a death, it was an erasure, a calculated act meant to shatter a dynasty, disrupt a republic, and seize a throne. And it happened not in war, but at a dinner party. In the world of the Medici, where power was served with every course, betrayal came dressed in velvet, and death wore a smile. Tonight, we peel back the silk curtains of history to uncover a feast that changed the fate of Renaissance Italy forever. Picture this: Florence, 1537. The air is thick with incense and anticipation at the Palazzo Medici. The elite of Renaissance Italy gather for a grand banquet, the kind that will be whispered about for centuries. Silver platters gleam, goblets of wine gleam like rubies, and servers glide across mosaic floors, carrying delicate dishes of truffles, peacock, and exotic spices. At the head of the table sits Alessandro de' Medici, grandson of Lorenzo the Magnificent, scion of one of the most powerful families in Europe. The Medici rule Florence, fiscally, politically, culturally, and tonight represents more than celebration. It's an act of power, of unity, of legacy. But beneath the glitter lies a simmering storm. Court factions bristle with jealousy. Exiled families plot. A courtier, once loyal, now craves control, because at this table, silverware and secrets are hand in hand, and somewhere between the first toast and the final course, poison will find its way in. Before we delve into who did it and why, we need to understand how this family, once mere bankers, rose to imperial prominence. How a legacy built on wool, papal favour, and Medici cunning became ripe for assassination. Because ambition cuts deeper than any knife, and sometimes it hides in the wine. By the end of this hour, we'll walk through the long corridors of betrayal, from plot to plate, and expose a meal of doom that reverberated across Europe. This isn't just a story of poison, it's about dynastic survival, political theatre, and the failure of trust in a world where power never sleeps. So take your seat and beware. In Renaissance Italy, even the finest feast could be a death sentence. The palazzo shimmered with gold and candlelight. On the evening of December 23rd, 1582, Florence's elite gathered within the grand dining hall of the Medici estate. The occasion, a celebration of alliances, legacy, and perhaps most importantly, power. At the head of the long, ornately carved banquet table sat Francesco de' Medici, Grand Duke of Tuscany. To his right was his second wife, Bianca Capello, elegant, controversial, and deeply loathed by many in the court. The feast was a dazzling display of Florentine wealth with roasted peacocks, candied fruits, and flagons of wine flowing freely. But among the gilded cutlery and fragrant stews, something sinister was brewing, literally. The guest list that night was tight, exclusive, and politically charged. Francesco had recently signed secret agreements with Spain, raising concerns among rival Italian factions and the powerful House of Habsburg. Whispers floated through the candlelit corridors that someone wanted the Medici weakened, or wiped out entirely. Many in the court believed Bianca had too much influence over the Grand Duke, while others saw her merely as a pawn in a far more intricate game. And on this particular night, as the guests raised their goblets in tribute, someone had laced the wine with more than just spice. Almost immediately after the banquet, both Francesco and Bianca fell gravely ill. At first, the symptoms were dismissed as mere indigestion, the consequence of overindulgence. But within hours they were writhing in pain, delirium, vomiting, cold sweats. The Grand Duke, who had survived political revolts and foreign threats, now lay gasping in his bed. Bianca too was stricken, her breathing laboured, her skin ashen. Physicians were summoned, but their potions and poultices were useless. Within a week, both were dead. Officially, the cause was malaria. But few believed it. Historians now consider the Medici deaths among the most suspicious in Renaissance Europe. Many fingers pointed to Francesco's brother, Cardinal Ferdinando de' Medici, who notably had everything to gain. With Francesco dead and no legitimate male heirs left, Ferdinando could step out from behind his cardinal robes and seize the title of Grand Duke. And that's exactly what he did. Within days of the deaths, he abandoned the clergy, took control of Florence and ordered Bianca's body buried in an unmarked grave, denied the honours due a duchess. The sudden demise of both ruler and consort, within hours of each other, at a dinner where only select people dined, well, it didn't take long for rumours to become legend. Later exhumations of the couple's remains showed high levels of arsenic, pointing not to illness but to deliberate poisoning. Was the feast the perfect setup? Did someone slip the toxin into a shared dish or cup? Or did Bianca, desperate for control, miscalculate a dose meant for someone else? Theories abound, but one thing is certain: that night's dinner was more than a meal. It was the closing act of a power struggle that would reshape Tuscany. When the Grand Duke and his Duchess died within a span of hours, Florence shuddered, but the ripples reached far beyond Tuscany. The sudden erasure of Francesco de' Medici and Bianca Capello sent shockwaves through European courts, for it was not merely the death of two individuals, it was the abrupt collapse of a carefully engineered succession. And in the absence of public mourning, a more enduring reaction took root: suspicion. Officially, court physicians announced the cause of death as malaria, a common illness in the marshy outskirts of Tuscany. Yet this explanation rang hollow to many. Both Francesco and Bianca had suffered malaria before. Why would it kill them so rapidly now? More disturbingly, no one else at the dinner banquet was affected. No servants, no nobles, no kitchen staff. Just the Grand Duke and his controversial bride. The first to voice his doubts was a Venetian ambassador who penned a letter claiming the deaths came not from air or water, but from the hand of man. The hand in question? Cardinal Ferdinando de' Medici. He arrived with disturbing speed following the deaths, shedding his religious vows within days and taking the reins of the duchy. His first order? Ensure Bianca's burial was kept private. No procession, no honours, no monument. Her body was interred hastily in the same church that held Francesco's tomb, but in an unmarked vault, her presence erased from official memory. For centuries, the mystery lingered. Then, in the late 20th century, science caught up with rumour. In 2004, researchers exhumed the remains of Francesco and Bianca, seeking clarity. Using hair analysis and bone samples, forensic scientists detected unusually high levels of arsenic in both bodies, levels consistent with slow poisoning. Francesco's body showed a prolonged exposure, while Bianca's hair revealed a spike shortly before death. This changed everything. Arsenic was widely available during the Renaissance, used in cosmetics, medicine, even pest control. But in court intrigue, it was the weapon of choice. Tasteless, odourless, and easy to dissolve in wine or soup, arsenic became known as inheritance powder. One dose could sicken a man for days, giving the illusion of natural illness. Several doses could kill him outright. So who delivered the fatal dose? If it was Ferdinando, it was executed flawlessly. But there are other theories. Some historians argue Bianca herself may have orchestrated a misguided plan, perhaps to poison a rival or eliminate Francesco's lingering allies. One version even suggests a double cross, Bianca attempting to poison someone else at the banquet, only to consume the dish herself. Other whispers speak of a foreign hand, Spanish or Habsburg agents sent to destabilize Florence disguised as kitchen help or attendants. But most roads lead back to Ferdinando. The cardinal turned Grand Duke wasted no time in reversing many of Francesco's policies. He strengthened ties with the papacy, welcomed Spanish ambassadors, and restored traditional Medici values. Under his rule, Florence became more conservative, more devout, and far less tolerant of figures like Bianca. He reopened long-closed monasteries and disbanded Francesco's scientific court, replacing alchemists with theologians. Even the aesthetics of Florence shifted, as paintings of the Duchess were quietly removed from galleries, her name struck from family records. What could not be erased, however, was the lingering ghost of that dinner party. For centuries, it remained a cautionary tale of ambition and betrayal. A glittering night, orchestrated to impress allies and dignitaries, that instead became a silent crime scene. While the palace in Poggio a Caiano was cloaked in mourning, beyond Florence's walls, a more calculating silence prevailed. In the embassies and royal courts of Europe, whispers travelled faster than any courier. Francesco Guern and Bianca Capello were dead, and not by illness, many believed, but by invisible hands. But whose hands? For some, the answer lay not within Tuscany, but far beyond its borders. At the heart of this theory was the precarious geopolitical balance of late 16th century Europe. The Medici were no longer mere bankers or local nobles. They were a dynasty with papal ties, foreign marriages, and vast trade interests. Francesco's independent court, embracing alchemy, foreign thinkers, and economic freedom, posed a challenge to the more conservative Catholic monarchies of Spain and Austria. And Bianca, with her Venetian lineage and rumoured sympathies for reformist ideas, was seen by some as dangerously modern. Spain, the greatest superpower of the era, had long viewed Tuscany as a key chess piece in the Mediterranean. Control of Florence meant control of critical trade routes, political alliances, and influence over the Pope. Francesco's policies had drifted toward independence, his alliances uncertain, his personal interests alchemical rather than ecclesiastical. This divergence worried the Spanish crown, and what Spain could not influence diplomatically, it often resolved with poison. Documents uncovered from the Spanish archives hint at clandestine orders, coded messages sent to Florentine allies urging stabilization of the duchy. Some historians interpret these as green lights for an assassination, quiet, deniable, and timed perfectly. Others point to agents embedded in the Medici court, servants who mysteriously vanished after the deaths, or physicians whose loyalty shifted with the winds of power. But Spain was not the only suspect. The Habsburg Empire, constantly maneuvering to protect its own marriage alliances and papal leverage, had reason to fear a Florence too independent. Francesco had long flirted with alliances beyond the Vatican's grasp. His court welcomed Protestant visitors, English merchants, and thinkers who questioned Catholic orthodoxy. This threatened more than religious purity. It jeopardized the delicate web of royal bloodlines and treaties that held Europe together. Bianca's influence also complicated things. Though dismissed as a courtesan by her enemies, she was no fool. Intelligent, politically savvy, and fiercely protective of her position, Bianca had begun reaching out to other courts, perhaps to secure her son's future, perhaps to consolidate her own. Some letters suggest she was in contact with envoys from Venice and even France, seeking support should Francesco fall out of favour with the Pope or Ferdinando. Such ambitions made her dangerous. In the eyes of Europe's powers, a woman with no noble blood but great political sway was a threat best removed. There are even darker speculations. Some researchers propose that the dinner where Francesco and Bianca met their end was infiltrated, not by a Florentine but by a foreign operative. A poisoner trained in slow death, dosing their food or drink with arsenic so expertly that symptoms would mimic natural decline. In one theory, the poison was delivered not in wine, but in the steaming herbal concoctions Francesco often took to ease his gout, served by a new apothecary who disappeared shortly after. Of course, these threads are circumstantial. The perfect crime leaves no evidence, only voids. But in the realm of dynasties, voids often speak louder than facts. Within weeks of Francesco's death, Spain's ambassadors were congratulating Ferdinando. Venice made no protest. Rome breathed a quiet sigh of relief. A duchy once drifting into heresy and humanism was now securely Catholic, controlled by a former cardinal, and back in the orbit of the Vatican. Ferdinando himself wasted no time in asserting his strength. He married Christina of Lorraine, a French noblewoman with Habsburg ties, re-cementing alliances and calming foreign tensions. He restored Florence's religious institutions and forced Francesco's old allies out of court. Bianca's memory was not just erased, it was scrubbed from the official Medici family tree. In the power games of Renaissance Europe, blood was often less effective than ink. Treaties sealed fates, but dinner parties sealed dynasties. As the bells tolled for Francesco I, the fate of Bianca Capello was sealed, not just in death but in legacy. In life, she had clawed her way from scandal to status. In death, she was discarded as a footnote, a warning, a ghost that haunted the Medici legacy. Ferdinando wasted no time. Days after claiming power, he initiated a subtle but deliberate erasure. Bianca's portraits were removed from the palace walls. Her seal was revoked from official documents. Any mention of her as Grand Duchess was systematically purged. In the official Medici archives, she was listed only as Francesco's concubine, her brief time as a royal consort buried beneath administrative coldness. For a woman who had once ruled beside a Grand Duke, it was a quiet annihilation. But ghosts are stubborn things. Despite the political purge, Bianca's story refused to die. In Florence, whispers of her presence lingered in the corridors of Poggio a Caiano. Servants spoke of her voice echoing in the hallways of cold spots near her former bedchambers. One legend claimed that on the anniversary of her death, her figure could be seen in the garden, walking silently beneath the moonlight, still searching for her lost child. Writers and artists of the next century, particularly during the Romantic period, rediscovered Bianca. They weren't interested in her political missteps or courtly etiquette. They saw in her a tragic heroine, a woman who defied class, gender and power to love a Grand Duke, only to be betrayed by a dynasty that never truly accepted her. Her story became the subject of operas, novels, and whispered stories passed from generation to generation in Tuscan taverns. What remains fascinating, though, is how this ghost story merged with fact. In the 19th century, as scientific interest in the Medici grew, her body was exhumed along with Francesco's. Tests were inconclusive, traces of arsenic were found, but no official cause of death could be confirmed. This ambiguity only added fuel to the fire. Was it really poison? Or illness? Or, as some believed, divine punishment for Bianca's ambition? Ferdinando's propaganda machine had painted Bianca as a scheming courtesan, a usurper who bewitched Francesco with alchemy and ambition. But more recent historians have challenged this view. Bianca was deeply involved in court politics, contributed to the design of Florentine gardens, and supported economic reforms. She wasn't just a lover. She was a participant in the machinery of power. If anything, she was a woman ahead of her time, and that may have been the greatest threat of all. In modern Florence, her name still evokes curiosity. Tourists trace her path, from the narrow Venetian alley of her birth to the Medici palaces she once graced. Poggio a Caiano now hosts art exhibits and reenactments of that fateful feast. Guides speak of the poisoned meal with theatrical dread, but when they mention Bianca, there's a subtle shift in tone, an unspoken reverence for the woman who dared to defy her place. In literature and film, she's often portrayed not as villain or victim, but as enigma, a beautiful ghost flickering between two worlds, the grandeur of Renaissance Florence and the shadows that swallowed her memory. So perhaps Bianca Capello never truly died that night. Perhaps she became something more powerful than a duchess or even a queen, an immortal story. One that cannot be exiled by decree or buried by politics. And in the end, maybe that's what terrified the Medici most. To understand how a dynasty could be undone at a single dinner table, we must delve into the shadowy science of the Renaissance, where apothecaries, alchemists, and assassins often worked with the same set of tools. In the 16th century, poison wasn't just a murder weapon, it was an art, a language, a subtle code whispered through noble courts. By the time of the Medici, poison had long been woven into the fabric of Italian politics. It was the invisible blade, the unseen dagger that required no duel, no bloodshed. And its mastery lay not just in its lethality, but in its ambiguity, a slow, elegant death that mimicked disease, something no physician could diagnose or dare to accuse. The Medici themselves were rumoured to possess a book, Il Libro dei Veleni, the Book of Poisons. Part legend, part reality, this compendium was said to contain recipes for toxins derived from exotic plants, minerals, and even animal venom. Among its ingredients, belladonna, arsenic, white hellebore, and aqua tofana, a notorious concoction believed to cause heart failure in a matter of hours while leaving the body apparently unmarked. Francesco I, ironically, was fascinated by toxicology. He maintained one of the finest private laboratories in Europe. In his spare time, he distilled compounds, studied natural poisons, and corresponded with alchemists and physicians. Some records even suggest he brewed antidotes, creating complex tinctures to test on animals, but perhaps he underestimated how easily that knowledge could be turned against him. The idea that both Francesco and Bianca succumbed to malaria within hours of each other was always questionable. Malaria was common in Tuscany, yes, but rarely did it strike a couple simultaneously. More curious still, both had been seen drinking a shared medicinal wine that evening, meant to aid Francesco's digestion. Within hours they were vomiting and hallucinating. By morning, they were dead. Centuries later, modern forensic analysis of their remains revealed elevated arsenic levels in Francesco's bones, levels that couldn't be explained by accidental exposure. Bianca's results were less conclusive, leading to endless debate. Was she a victim or complicit? At the time, poison was also bound up with mysticism. Apothecaries consulted planetary alignments and astrological charts to determine when poisons would be most potent. The boundary between science and sorcery was perilously thin. Some even believed poison could be spiritually charged to act faster, depending on the hatred behind the intention. Ferdinando, the younger brother, had spent years as a cardinal in Rome, a city where whispers of poisonings were as common as prayers. Some say he returned to Florence with allies well versed in the art of subtle death. Others point to his sudden fluency in court intrigue, eliminating rivals without open conflict. If poison was used at the feast, it was delivered by someone with precision, patience, and plausible deniability. The weapon may not have been a blade or a gun, but a chalice, a cordial, a glass of wine laced with fate. And as bodies were buried and suspicions buried deeper, the real power of poison revealed itself, not just in its effect on the body, but in its power to erase certainty, to leave behind only questions. Was it a crime, a coincidence, or divine justice cloaked in chemistry? In the court of the Medici, truth was always filtered through layers of performance. But poison didn't lie. It only whispered slowly through the bloodstream, until history could no longer tell if it was ever there at all. As Francesco III and Bianca lay dead, their bodies still warm in the Villa Medici at Poggio a Caiano, the wheels of power began to turn, and at their centre stood one man, Ferdinando de' Medici, younger brother to the Grand Duke, former Cardinal of Rome, and a man whose patience had finally paid off. Ferdinando was no stranger to court politics. While Francesco immersed himself in art, alchemy, and his relationship with Bianca, Ferdinando had been quietly cultivating influence in Rome. As a cardinal, he'd mastered diplomacy, played the Vatican's delicate games, and developed alliances with some of Europe's most ruthless political minds. He had the ear of the Pope and the favour of Spain. So when news of the sudden deaths reached Florence, Ferdinando moved swiftly. He left the cloth behind, literally resigning his cardinalship, and returned home not as a priest, but as a prince. He didn't mourn in public. He didn't hesitate. He simply assumed control. The court was stunned, but not opposed. Francesco had been viewed as aloof, a man more interested in science than statecraft. Bianca, still considered by many to be a social climber and usurper, had few defenders. Their passing, however sudden, felt like an unspoken relief to some. The line of succession had been uncertain, clouded by the legitimacy of Bianca's children. But Ferdinando, he was unmistakably Medici. He was acceptable to both the Florentine elite and the foreign powers that mattered. Still, Ferdinando knew that seizing power was only the first move. He needed to erase doubts, smooth over the narrative, and secure the legacy. The official cause of death? Malaria. A convenient explanation that required no investigation, no scandal. The doctors were paid, the bodies buried, no autopsies, no noise. And then, one by one, Ferdinando began consolidating power. He annulled many of Francesco's policies, purged Bianca's allies from court, and restored the Medici brand to something more stable, more respectable. Under his rule, Florence reasserted itself diplomatically. Trade flourished. Alliances were reforged. He married Christina of Lorraine, a granddaughter of Catherine de' Medici, linking his line to powerful French blood. The dynasty would survive, but only because he had taken control. Whispers persisted. Some said the timing of the deaths was too perfect. Others claimed Ferdinando had kept a personal alchemist close at hand, one who specialized in colorless, tasteless poisons. But no one dared to speak too loudly. In the Renaissance, silence was often the key to survival. Centuries later, historians and scientists would exhume the mystery, literally. Forensic teams studied the remains of Francesco and Bianca in the 2000s. Arsenic levels in Francesco's body were 10 times higher than expected. Bianca's were harder to interpret. But the implications were clear. The malaria story had holes. Still, no concrete proof ever emerged linking Ferdinando to the deaths. And in the end, perhaps that was the true genius of his coup. He never needed to be caught. He only needed to be king. The Renaissance was a world in flux, where knowledge and power blurred, where murder could be medicine, and where the death of a brother could be the birth of a new era. Ferdinando ruled for decades. He would modernize Florence, expand the Medici patronage, and ensure the family remained at the center of European power. But behind the gilded portraits and the grand architecture was a secret, a quiet betrayal sealed behind wine glasses and silk curtains. And if the rumors were true, the greatest alchemy of all was not turning lead into gold, but turning death into destiny. Florence awoke to whispers. 2 deaths in one night. A Grand Duke and his consort gone, just like that. The official proclamation blamed malaria, a cruel but familiar affliction in Tuscany's lowlands. Yet something didn't sit right. The autumn air wasn't thick with disease. No servants were infected. No physicians warned of a wider outbreak. And the deaths had occurred not during a slow decline, but within mere hours of each other. Still, the streets of Florence did not erupt in mourning. There was no riot, no candlelit vigil, no public grief. Francesco, I had always been a ruler of interiors, more present in his laboratories than in his courts. Bianca, even in her finest jewels, had never shaken the stigma of being the pharmacist's daughter. To the nobles, her sudden death was a political reset. To the people, it was barely a footnote. But behind palace doors, the reaction was far more complex. The Medici inner circle was scrambling to manage optics. There were questions that needed silencing, and fast. Why was no autopsy performed? Why was the funeral rushed? Why had Ferdinando appeared so prepared? The court's official narrative tightened like a velvet noose. Portraits of Francesco were draped in black. A formal funeral was held, but it was curiously sparse. Bianca's coffin was tucked into a side crypt, her remains buried without state honours. For a woman who had once called herself Grand Duchess, she was quickly and quietly erased. Meanwhile, Ferdinando orchestrated what can only be described as a masterclass in public relations. He made appearances at churches, visited orphanages, and granted tax reliefs to the merchant class. He embraced the symbols of continuity, wearing Francesco's ring, preserving certain policies, even commissioning artwork that suggested a seamless transition. To most observers, it looked like a steady hand taking the reins in a time of turbulence. But some weren't fooled. Ambassadors from Spain and France sent coded letters back to their courts, raising suspicions. Papal envoys reported a scent of treachery in the air. A few courtiers even dared to say it aloud, in hushed tones, that perhaps Francesco had been poisoned. That perhaps Bianca had been silenced to prevent her influence, that perhaps the real cause of death was ambition, not illness. Yet no evidence surfaced, no witnesses came forward, and over time, the speculation dulled. It was replaced by the numbing rhythm of governance. Life resumed, commerce thrived, Florence, always pragmatic, moved on. It wasn't until centuries later, when forensic scientists gained access to the Medici tombs, that the shadows stirred again. The exhumation of Francesco's body revealed unnatural levels of arsenic. The samples weren't contaminated. The data was clean. Suddenly, what had once been rumour now had scientific weight. But that revelation only deepened the mystery. Who administered the poison? Was it a servant loyal to Ferdinando? Was it slipped into a glass of wine by a court physician? Or perhaps Bianca herself was the intended victim, and Francesco was merely collateral damage. Theories proliferated, each darker than the last. Some even proposed that Bianca had poisoned Francesco in a bid to gain control, only to be poisoned in turn. Others believed Ferdinando had hired apothecaries who knew the properties of white arsenic intimately. Poison without taste, odourless, indistinguishable from a common digestive powder. No records survived. No deathbed confession ever surfaced. And Ferdinando, he never spoke of it again. In portraits painted after his ascent, he appears calm, measured, pious even. He built churches. He funded science. He ruled for years. But in every gilded frame, behind his calm gaze, there seems to linger a trace of something else, a quiet calculation. And in the Medici archives, where letters were copied and filed, one finds a curious absence. No mention of Bianca's final moments. No detailed death account. Just a name, a date, and a brief line. Died suddenly of illness. History had been edited, but the silence screamed. The deaths of Francesco Boer and Bianca Capello did not just mark the end of a controversial love affair, they marked the tipping point in the political trajectory of Tuscany. What followed was not just a succession, but a transformation. Ferdinando de' Medici, once a cardinal with no ambition to rule, had now taken full control of the Grand Duchy, and the realm would never look the same. With the bodies still warm and suspicions lingering, Ferdinando launched a campaign of recalibration. His first move was symbolic but telling. He had Bianca's name struck from state records. Official Medici family trees suddenly ended Francesco's line with no mention of his Venetian consort. The woman once crowned Grand Duchess by love alone was now unmade by decree. Then came the reforms. Under Francesco, science had flourished, but the state had languished. Its coffers drained, its military weakened, its noble families restless. Ferdinando reversed course. He restructured the Florentine navy, reopened trade channels with the Ottoman Empire, and invited Jewish merchants into Livorno under promises of tolerance and tax incentives. In just a few years, Tuscany went from fragile duchy to bustling economic force. But beneath the administrative brilliance, a darker undertow remained. The court had learned a lesson, not just about power, but about perception. Silence, it seemed, was a more useful tool than justice. And in the silence, the myth of the poisoned feast took root, not as fact, but as a fable whispered between diplomats, dramatized by playwrights, and passed in secret among the merchant elite. The Medici court never acknowledged the poison, but they never denied it either. Some historians now argue that the event was pivotal in reshaping Florentine politics into a colder, more Machiavellian arena. After all, if the Grand Duke himself could be quietly eliminated with no consequence, then who was truly safe? Trust evaporated among the inner circles. Servants were rotated more frequently. Food tasters became the norm. Even the Medici chapel, once a place of opulent spiritual expression, began to reflect a quieter, more guarded tone in its commissioned art. And what of the city itself? Florence moved forward, but never forgot. The Palazzo Pitti, where the dinner took place, gained a new nickname: La Casa dei Fantasmi, the House of Ghosts. Visitors claimed to hear footsteps in empty corridors. Some swore Bianca's shadow could be seen in moonlight against the grand dining hall's windows. The rumours persisted not because they were credible, but because they captured a lingering truth, that this feast had left a wound in the city's psyche. In the centuries that followed, the story of the poisoned dinner morphed into legend. It appeared in operas and Gothic novels, with each retelling more dramatic than the last. Bianca became a tragic temptress. Francesco, a doomed alchemist blinded by love. Ferdinando, the calculating usurper cloaked in religious piety. And somewhere, perhaps, the real story was lost entirely, but not quite. Modern historians, armed with chemistry and curiosity, exhumed the Medici tombs and dusted off centuries-old letters. Bit by bit, a clearer picture emerged, one in which ambition, fear, and silence conspired to remove obstacles in the most definitive way possible. No blade, no trial, just a toast, a cough, a final breath. It was not merely a dinner, It was a realignment of destiny. And the poison? It became more than substance, it became a symbol. The Medici were already a dynasty woven into the fabric of Renaissance Europe. But after that fateful feast, they became something else. A warning, a cautionary tale about the cost of love, the hunger for power, and the lengths to which history's great families would go to protect their legacies. Centuries passed. The Medici name became synonymous with Renaissance brilliance. Patrons of Michelangelo, protectors of Galileo, architects of a golden age. Yet the darker chapters, like the alleged poisoning of Francesco Ferd and Bianca Capello, remained unresolved, that is, until science came knocking at the Medici tombs. It began with a question: could modern forensic methods uncover what political whispers had kept buried? In the early 2000s, a team of Italian scientists, historians and archaeologists sought to examine the remains of several Medici family members. Their target? The long-sealed crypts of San Lorenzo, the basilica where Francesco and Bianca had been laid to rest in 1587. The work was delicate. The bodies, wrapped in now crumbling fabric, had not seen daylight in over 4 centuries. With gloved hands and surgical precision, researchers collected bone and hair samples. What they found was astonishing. Francesco's remains revealed elevated levels of arsenic, not the trace amounts occasionally found in soil, but concentrations consistent with prolonged or acute poisoning. Bianca's body showed similar signs, yet it wasn't just arsenic, it was arsenic trioxide, a deadly, tasteless powder popular among Renaissance poisoners for its reliability and subtlety. Even small doses over several days could mimic malaria or dysentery, symptoms both Francesco and Bianca were reported to have suffered. This revelation reignited debate. Was this the definitive proof of murder long suspected? Not everyone was convinced. Detractors argued the contamination could have occurred from the embalming process or environmental factors. Others pointed to inconsistencies in records, conflicting accounts of their symptoms, a lack of reliable autopsy notes, and politically charged motives behind the exhumation itself. Still, the discovery could not be dismissed. The Medici, it seemed, had left behind more than just art and palaces. They had left a chemical fingerprint of their final hours. Even more curious was what was found not in the bodies, but in the cellars below the Palazzo Pitti and Villa Medici. Old ledgers recorded vast orders of mercury, arsenic, and other substances used in both alchemy and assassination. Small glass vials were unearthed, labelled in 16th century Latin with cryptic names: Aqua Divina, Lacrimae Serpentis, Spiritus Mortis. It was unclear whether these were healing tinctures or deadly compounds, perhaps both. Adding to the intrigue was a forgotten Medici servant's diary, discovered in a private Florentine collection. In it, a cryptic passage described a final supper, where wine ran sweet and heavy, and Bianca would not smile by morning. Was this merely poetic, or an eyewitness account cloaked in careful metaphor? Scholars began revisiting the biographies of Ferdinando de' Medici. Once seen as the dutiful younger brother who brought stability, his motivations were reinterpreted. He had gained everything from Francesco's death: land, title, political favour. His removal of Bianca from the records, once seen as an act of protocol, now looked more like the erasure of a crime. And yet, no confession exists, no smoking gun, just the eerie convergence of opportunity, motive, and forensic suggestion. This ambiguity gives the story its enduring power. The poisoned feast isn't just about what happened, it's about what could have happened. It forces us to confront the limitations of evidence and the reliability of memory. In a world where so much history was rewritten by the victors, how many other dinners, deaths, and disappearances were explained away with polite euphemisms? The truth may be sealed behind stone crypts, or hidden in coded letters yet to be deciphered. But one thing is certain: the Medici dinner remains one of history's most compelling unsolved cases, not because we lack answers, but because we now have just enough to ask better questions. To understand the true danger Bianca Capello posed to the Medici dynasty, we must look beyond Florence, eastward across the Apennines to the shimmering canals of Venice. Bianca's homeland wasn't just a place of beauty and romance, it was a republic forged by merchants, spies, and secrets. And Bianca, born into this world, was not the passive mistress history once painted her to be. She came from a noble but declining Venetian family. Her early years were marked not by privilege but by pressure. The pressure to marry well, secure alliances, and escape the slow financial suffocation that haunted many patrician households. But Bianca didn't wait to be married off. At just 15, she fled Venice with a Florentine clerk, Pietro Bonaventuri, scandalizing her city and enraging her family. It was a bold move, a young woman crossing borders, defying her class, and choosing her own path. Venice responded with fury. They demanded her return. The Serenissima was notoriously protective of its noble daughters. Some believed Bianca knew too much. She had grown up among whispering courtiers and merchant lords who made deals in shadowed corners. Rumours swirled that she had access to private family ledgers, correspondence between Venice and foreign embassies, even codes used in espionage. Was it possible that her sudden departure wasn't just about love, but about leverage? Once in Florence, Bianca transformed. She used her beauty and intelligence to weave herself into the Medici court. By the time Francesco took her as his mistress, some Venetian records hinted she may have been acting as an invisible eye for the Republic. A Venetian spy in the heart of the Tuscan court. It sounds like fiction, but in the Renaissance, the lines between seduction, diplomacy, and espionage were razor thin. Letters intercepted decades later in private archives suggest Bianca may have kept contact with her Venetian relatives throughout her time in Florence. One unsigned note, coded in the cipher Venice often used with its diplomats, referenced La Perla d'Oro, the golden pearl, often interpreted as a reference to Bianca. The note referred to continued access to the prince's table and study, implying a degree of influence that could tilt political outcomes. If true, this changed everything. Francesco's deepening love for Bianca may not have been entirely romantic. It may have been politically compromising. Other Italian states, already wary of Medici expansion, feared that Francesco was being manipulated by a woman whose loyalties lay elsewhere. Ferdinando, shrewd and loyal to Florence above all, may have seen Bianca not only as an embarrassment, but as a legitimate national threat. Her elevation to Grand Duchess mere days before her death may have been the tipping point. For years, Francesco had petitioned the Pope to legitimize their union, to have Bianca crowned alongside him. When the Vatican finally relented, the old nobility of Florence erupted in private outrage. To them, a foreigner, possibly a spy, had infiltrated their highest seat of power. Now, with a sudden illness sweeping through the Villa Medici just days later, the timing felt far too convenient. Was her death orchestrated not just to remove a rival, but to erase a liability? Some historians argue that the Vatican, or Venice, or even Ferdinando himself, may have conspired to eliminate both Francesco and Bianca in one silent coup. The poisoning, then, wasn't just personal, it was geopolitical. And yet, Bianca's legacy refused to vanish. Even in death, she haunted Florentine folklore. Some called her a saint, others a witch. Children whispered stories of her golden ring that could predict betrayal, or her mirror that showed not reflections but secrets. None of it could be proven, but all of it endured. She was more than Francesco's lover. She was a symbol of agency, of disruption, and perhaps of espionage. Whether she came to Florence out of love or ambition, she left behind a trail of mysteries that no dynasty could bury completely. As the bitter taste of poison lingered in the air, so too did the consequences. The immediate aftermath of the banquet was chaos cloaked in etiquette. Physicians whispered diagnoses to frightened noblewomen, priests recited prayers over barely conscious bodies, and yet no one dared say aloud what they feared most, that someone had engineered this massacre. Word of Francesco's sudden death spread swiftly, but suspicions grew faster. Bianca Capello, his once glorified consort and now Grand Duchess, found herself under a microscope. Her enemies, many and powerful, saw an opportunity. Rumours swirled that she had poisoned Francesco herself to retain power. Within just hours of his death, Bianca collapsed too. Whether out of guilt, fear, or from the same cup as her husband, she died in agony, silencing whatever truth she might have spoken. But Francesco and Bianca were not the only casualties of this dark dinner. The Medici legacy itself took a mortal blow that day. The sudden vacuum at the top allowed Ferdinando de' Medici, Francesco's brother, to seize control. A cardinal with political ambitions, Ferdinando renounced his vows and installed himself as Grand Duke. Though outwardly smooth, this transition masked a brutal internal reckoning. Loyalists to Francesco were purged, property seized, and records burned. The official explanation? A combination of malaria and stomach illness. But few believed it. The Grand Duchy of Tuscany, once admired for its grandeur and art, had become a house of secrets and whispered poisonings. The effects rippled through Florence. The Medici court, already fragile, was now paranoid, fractured, and watched by foreign powers eager to pounce. Spanish and Austrian envoys observed with interest. Could Tuscany fall to a foreign crown? Could the balance of Italian power be shifted with the slip of a cup? This single dinner party, with its death toll and mystery, became a cautionary tale for European nobility. No alliance, no feast, no dynasty was ever truly secure. Behind closed doors, investigators quietly tried to reconstruct the night's events. The utensils were washed, the food discarded, servants vanished or refused to speak. No definitive proof ever emerged. Some believed the poison had been in the wine, others in the dessert. One theory posited that Bianca, familiar with herbal alchemy, accidentally dosed both herself and Francesco while attempting to murder only one. Others were convinced Ferdinando orchestrated the entire event to regain control. The truth dissolved like sugar in wine, sweet, sharp, and irretrievable. Centuries later, the question still haunts historians and forensic scientists alike. What really happened that night in Poggio a Caiano? As time eroded the palatial halls and the banqueting room faded into dust, the legend only grew. But it wasn't until the 20th and 21st centuries that science tried to do what gossip never could, find the truth in the bones. In 2004, a team of Italian scientists exhumed the remains of Francesco I and Bianca Capello from their tombs in Florence's Medici chapels. The goal was simple in theory: analyze traces of arsenic or other common poisons that could definitively point to foul play. But the results were far from conclusive. Minor quantities of arsenic were discovered, enough to raise suspicion, but not enough to settle the matter. Some experts argued that arsenic was a common ingredient in 16th century embalming fluid, while others insisted the levels were consistent with acute poisoning. The mystery deepened. Even in death, the Medici refused to yield a clear answer. But what science couldn't settle, folklore eagerly filled. In Florentine lore, the spirits of Francesco and Bianca are said to still wander the gardens of Villa Medici, forever searching for the poisoned goblet that sealed their fate. Locals whisper that the banquet table reappears on stormy nights, laid out in ghostly splendor, only for the chairs to collapse one by one, as if unseen guests fall dead again and again. The tale has become a modern Gothic legend, a cursed love, a deadly ambition, and a dinner that echoes across time. Beyond superstition, the event has also become a parable of dynastic decline. The Medici, once the architects of the Renaissance, were now reduced to a family devouring itself from within. The death of Francesco I, the last gasp of the Medici's golden age. His successor, Ferdinando I, would attempt to restore stability, but the magic was gone. The Medici would linger on for another century, but the poison, literal or symbolic, had already seeped too deep. The forensic debate continues in academic circles. Was it arsenic, digitalis, an alchemical poison lost to time? Or was it, perhaps, simply a coincidence? Two lovers falling victim to malaria or bad food? But most scholars agree on one thing: the sheer secrecy, the political fallout, and the timing all point to something darker than illness. This wasn't just death, it was an assassination of legacy sealed under silverware. When Francesco I and Bianca Capello died within hours of each other, behind the scenes a seismic shift was already underway. The Medici court moved quickly, too quickly perhaps, as if someone had planned for this very outcome. Before the bodies had even cooled, Cardinal Ferdinando de' Medici returned from Rome, stepping over the ashes of grief and into power. Ferdinando wasted no time erasing the legacy of his brother and sister-in-law. Bianca's body was quietly denied a burial in the Medici family crypt. Francesco's more reluctantly earned tomb was sealed with none of the fanfare typically granted a reigning Grand Duke. The Medici court was swept clean of their supporters. Loyalists to the couple were dismissed or quietly demoted, and any documents linking Ferdinando to political disagreements with Francesco vanished or were deliberately destroyed. It was a palace purge under the guise of mourning. But this wasn't just about clearing the chessboard. It was about resetting the pieces. Ferdinando's ascent ushered in a colder, more calculated regime. Under his rule, Florence became less a city of art and more a state of strategy. The patronage that once nourished Botticelli and Michelangelo dried into tighter circles of a political favour. Marriages were brokered not for love, but for alliances. Trade expanded, yes, but culture stagnated. The soul of Florence, many said, had died at that dinner table with Francesco and Bianca. Yet Ferdinando's reign was not without success. He strengthened Tuscany's naval power, allied with powerful European courts and modernised infrastructure. But everything came at a cost. Most of all, transparency. The deaths of Francesco and Bianca became a topic rarely spoken of in public. Within the Medici archives, any mention of the banquet seemed to vanish after 1587, as if the family had collectively decided that history itself should forget. But history never forgets. Whispers persisted in Florence's taverns, passed down in coded poems and oral tales. Artists painted allegories of poisoned lovers. Dramatists staged thinly veiled retellings of a feast of ghosts. The story clung to the family like a stain no coronation could bleach. And then there were the unanswered questions. Why had Francesco's physician, a known partisan of Ferdinando, delayed treatment the night of the banquet? Why were the post-mortem rituals rushed and guarded? Why had no clergy been summoned to Bianca's deathbed? Each missing answer only widened the cracks in Ferdinando's carefully constructed facade. What was supposed to be the start of a cleaner era had instead left a trail of silence louder than any trumpet of state. By the time the next generation of Medici heirs came into power, the tale had twisted into both warning and curse. Portraits of Francesco were moved into dim corners of galleries. Bianca was omitted from most genealogies. And the villa where they had died, once a jewel of leisure, fell into a slow, eerie decay, as if the house itself refused to forget. It always returns to that night, the dinner party that whispered the final verses of a family saga centuries in the making. Imagine the flicker of candlelight bouncing off polished goblets, the heavy scent of roasted pheasant and perfumed herbs, and the lingering tension beneath noble smiles. At that fateful table in Poggio, a Caiano, history pivoted. Francesco I, the melancholic Grand Duke, sat at the head. Across from him, Bianca Capello, the woman for whom he defied his family and his state. Around them, a curated few, courtiers, stewards, confidants, and perhaps unseen hands. The reconstructed account tells us the couple fell ill soon after the meal. Stomach pain, sweating, fever, hallucinations. By morning, Francesco was gravely ill. Bianca, frantic and sleepless, began showing signs just days later. Within a week, both were dead. Theories abound. Did Cardinal Ferdinando, the ambitious younger brother, orchestrate it to seize power? He certainly gained the throne almost immediately, and Bianca's body was swiftly buried, unbefitting a Grand Duchess, as though her memory needed erasing. Or was it an accident? Botched medicinal elixirs were common, and Francesco's laboratory, a strange blend of alchemist's chamber and apothecary, overflowed with dangerous compounds. Could the couple, in seeking health, have invited death instead? But perhaps the most unsettling theory is not political nor chemical, but emotional. That this was a tragic suicide pact disguised by time. Some have speculated that the couple, besieged by court politics, illness and infertility, may have chosen to exit history together. One final act of devotion written not in blood, but in bitter wine. Whatever the truth, the dinner table remains a haunting symbol, a setting meant for warmth and unity turned into a stage of cold finality. As the goblets clinked and the shadows danced on frescoed walls, no one would have known that they were witnessing the end, not just of a couple, but of a legacy. The Medici line, for all its brilliance, would never recover the grandeur of its golden age. Francesco and Bianca's deaths marked the beginning of the end. The family would stagger on for a few more decades, decorative, diluted, and eventually extinct. The feast at Poggio a Caiano became folklore. The poisoned meal, the secret coup, the silenced duchess. Yet beneath the scandal lies something more universal. A story of love challenged by power, of legacy destroyed by ambition, of mortality revealed at a banquet table. History didn't need to know for certain if the wine was poisoned. It only needed the image, the perfect tragic final act. A room filled with opulence, a toast raised in love, and two hearts that stopped before the candles did. The final breath of Francesco I and Bianca Capello didn't just silence two lives, it closed the door on an entire chapter of Renaissance ambition. And like so many turning points in history, it wasn't marked by war drums or royal decrees, but a quiet, deadly whisper at the dinner table. In the years that followed, Grand Duke Ferdinando took the throne. He ruled competently and expanded the Tuscan economy, but never escaped the shadow of that fatal feast. Whispers followed him. Did he poison his brother? Did he erase Bianca out of jealousy, politics, or both? Strangely, the official story insisted that malaria claimed their lives. But even 400 years later, in the early 2000s, scientists exhumed Francesco and Bianca's remains. Their bones told a different tale, showing elevated levels of arsenic, a poison known to mimic natural illness, especially when administered in slow, deliberate doses. Malaria? Perhaps. But the evidence also points to something far more human, premeditated, cold. What's chilling is how ordinary this was in Renaissance Italy. Poison had become a political language. The Borgias used it, the Sforzas used it, and within the Medici court, it was whispered to be as common as perfume. In this world of masks and masquerades where art and beauty flourished, so did betrayal. The dinner table became the battlefield, and the goblet? A weapon of choice. Yet this story refuses to fade, because it's not just about one meal or two deaths, it's about what we leave behind. Francesco was once the most powerful man in Tuscany. Bianca rose from scandal to royalty, and yet they are remembered not for governance or grandeur, but for how they died. It's a cruel legacy, and perhaps the only one designed to outlive the Medici themselves. As centuries passed, the palazzo where the feast was held aged into silence. The tapestries faded. The rumours lived on. Tourists walk its halls now, unaware that beneath their feet a dynasty once collapsed over dinner. The Medici name survives in art, architecture, and legend. But this story, the poisoned feast, remains its most haunting chapter. It reminds us that power is fragile, that ambition devours itself, that love, when tangled in courtly intrigue, can be as deadly as arsenic, and that the most dangerous meals in history weren't served in battle camps, but on silver platters beneath chandeliers, in the dead calm before a dynasty's fall. History often marks the downfall of empires with revolutions, invasions, or assassinations in darkened alleyways. But sometimes it happens with a clink of glasses, a lingering smile, and a poison that tastes of honey and betrayal. The story of Francesco I and Bianca Capello isn't just a tale of love and death. It's a parable about trust broken behind velvet curtains, about how the very people you dine with might raise a toast one moment and erase you from the line of succession the next. Their fate invites us to consider how fragile power truly is, and how even the most glittering courts hide rot beneath the gold. In the silence that followed their final meal, the Medici legacy began to fade, not with a bang, but with whispers of poison, of jealousy, of calculated disappearance. And though time buried the truth beneath layers of official records, ballads, and conflicting reports, The bones still speak. The evidence still lingers in vaults and test tubes. And the questions still haunt us. Would Francesco and Bianca have changed history had they lived? Or were they merely casualties of a dynasty that had outlived its harmony? We may never know, but their story has left behind something more powerful than certainty, a mystery that refuses to die. So, as you leave this tale behind, ask yourself, what other histories lie hidden beneath official stories? What other lives were rewritten by silent hands and silver cups? If you enjoyed this journey into the shadows of Renaissance intrigue, consider subscribing to uncover more history's hidden chapters. From buried scandals to forgotten empires, we'll continue peeling back the elegant masks of the past to reveal the raw, strange, and often sinister truths beneath.